Professor Lomellini, why is it so important to keep talking about terrorism today?
Thank you for this question. I think that terrorism is still a hot spot in the international relations, international politics. We have to consider terrorism in a historical perspective because this tells us that terrorism is an historical and cyclic phenomenon. This does not have to frighten us, but to persuade that the best moment to study and to think how to prevent it is now when it seems that it has been weakened at least in Europe. This has to be very clear, not just to the public opinion, but rather to the ruling class that should develop a crisis culture, avoiding to react against terrorism, always in an emergency manner. I would add, if I may, that the covert emergency seems to have also far-reaching political consequences, even in dealing with terrorism itself. Well, in the short term, extremists have quickly sought to exploit the current pandemic for propaganda purposes, and Jihadists have tried to incorporate this new phenomenon into their usual narratives, talking about a kind of divine punishment against the disbelievers. We have also to consider the medium-term analysis in which the COVID-19 could exacerbate the protests that inspire various forms of violent extremism, offering a potential opportunity for extremists in terms of growing radicalization. And this is particularly true not just in the Western countries, where, as you may know, I mean, the phenomenon seems to be it seems to decline, but is still very powerful in some African and Middle East areas, and that would be very dangerous indeed.
Professor Monar, how does the pandemic affect our security?
Even if we say that this pandemic as such is primarily a public health risk and concern and challenge, I would nevertheless say there are spillover effects from the COVID-19 pandemic, even if it's at the origin of a health issue, which can endanger our security in a larger sense. I will just give a few examples without trying to be comprehensive. One is, and what we are just doing now is, of course, we are meeting electronically, remotely. And the move to remote communication, remote meetings, remote exchanges has been massive across the globe in a completely unprecedented way. And here there are considerable security risks which can come from that, because you exchange partially very sensitive information which can be abused and which can actually enable people to do us harm in terms of using this confidential information against our interests, and for instance also the way in which governments now communicate between may actually lead to information spreading out which should not be in the public domain because it can be abused by criminal organizations. So I think there is a cybersecurity risk which links the health issue of the COVID-19 situation with hard security risks on the internal security side and potentially even the external security side. So it's one example. The other link with more traditional security challenges is that, as we can see, governments in Europe, but not only in Europe, are currently spending massively on stabilizing the economies of the different countries. And well, on the one hand, they clearly have a good reason to do so, because if we would face a major economic recession, and if we would face a destabilization of our economies and societies as a result of this recession, history has shown that you have a significant increase of security risks for citizens, because crime will grow and public authorities will weaken in their impact on keeping order in the society, etc. So here we have a very good reason for governments to be worried about stabilization of our economic and social systems, to avoid a descent into at least partial disorder because of a massive crisis. I'm a German, and of course, as a German, you always remember how the economic difficulties of the 1920s and the world economic crisis contributed to the rise of the Nazi Party. So here there is clearly something which needs attention. But for instance, you have other effects. If governments now spend huge amounts, in some cases unprecedented amounts, already now the planning in the European Union countries exceeds in many cases what was spent on the overcoming of the financial crisis starting in 2008. This means less money will be available for other tasks. And you have already questions, for instance, being asked whether, in order to at least offset part of this additional spending, the defense budgets should not be reduced in some of the countries. Now, and here, well, you can of course say, well, attention, if basically in order to fund these additional expenditures, we start reducing the defense budget in a context where the international order has become less predictable, if you look, for instance, at the Russian policy in the East, whether this is not also a security issue. So therefore I say, I would not classify the COVID-19 pandemic as a security issue in the classic sense. For me, it's essentially a public health issue, very important, very urgent one, but a public health issue. But there are links between this public health issue in terms of the consequences and other security issues.